I am Melissa Babbage. I'm the Vice Chair of the American Australian Association. And on behalf of my American colleagues, Craig Chapman, who's the Chair of the American Australian Association, and John Berry, the President of the American Australian Association, which we'll call the AAA from now on. And of course our local chair, John Olsen, and I wanted to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much. The Sydney Opera House is built on Gadigal country, so I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the lands in which this opera house stands, and their connections to the land, the sea and the community. We pay our respects to the Gadigal Nation elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all traditional custodians of this land. From the AAA, I would like in particular to express our gratitude and thanks to Christine Zeitz and Dave Perry at Northrop Grumman for your valued partnership and ongoing support of the AAA. I would of course like to acknowledge our speakers, the Honourable John Howard, who is with us in person, the Honourable Ellen Lord, who at some ungodly hour is joining us virtually from the United States, and we're extremely grateful for that, and Mr Cameron Stewart, who is our MC, into asking the important questions today. I'd also like to acknowledge some other guests that we have here today. The Honourable Jonathan O'Dea, MP, who's the Speaker of the New South Wales Parliament, thank you. And Mr Andre Francois Giraud, the Canadian Consul General. And I have mentioned Dave Perry, who's the Vice President and Chief Global Business Officer for Northrop Grumman and on the American Australian Association Board, and also Andrea Thompson, who's the Vice President of International Programs for Northrop Grumman. So we look forward to the benefit of everyone's insights today, and we hope it'll be a robust and enlightening discussion around AUKUS and the Alliance. Now, for anyone who is new to the AAA, I'd just like to share a little information and history. We have a long and impressive history of serving the relationship between the United States and Australia for more than 70 years. We've developed and strengthened the relationship by promoting cooperation, economic growth and cultural understanding. While our efforts have largely been driven out of the US, we are delighted to be increasing our Australian presence, building upon the very solid foundations already established here by John Olsen. So together we look forward to creating greater synergies and opportunities across the Pacific. Importantly, very importantly, since 2002, the AAA's philanthropic scholarship and grant programs have awarded over $14 million US to around 900 students, American and Australian graduates, veterans and artists, which further advance their careers, but also the next generation of leaders, develop the international networks and generating solutions that can help to address the global issues of our times. A few of our scholars are here with us today, which I'm delighted about. If you get the opportunity to seek them out and say hello, they've had some really, really interesting experiences as a result of heading across to the US and furthering their studies. So look, that's enough from me. Before we undertake our substantive policy discussion, we will have a short break to start our lunch, and then I'll be asking Christine Zeitz to open the formal proceedings. So thank you again and bon appetit.
And I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's policy discussion. So Christine Zeitz, I'm the General Manager Asia Pacific for Northrop Grumman, and I have the privilege of leading the Australian organisation. We have about 800 people around Australia providing capability to the Australian Defence Force, and we do that across various domains including air missile defence, satellite communications, aircraft sustainment and modernisation. And as a fundamental input to capability, we feel that at this important time it's a very, very important role we play, and we're delighted to do that. For Northrop Grumman in Australia, we have set, just over a year ago, we've set a new strategy for the Australian business. We've set a new structure, and we've invested in and opened our new engineering lab in Canberra called Parallax Labs. And the purpose of that is to enable the transfer of technology from the US in a secure and efficient way to our Australian our workforce and our partners. So this is for our current programs and also for those activities that will be enabled through, of course, this AUKUS agreement. As a long-standing member of the defence community over 30 years, I have seen over the past years the focus for Australia and our allies on the Indo-Pacific region. And as we see China's growing influence and, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we know that now is a more important time in a heightened security environment. So we see this AUKUS agreement as a fundamental agreement. You know, really we feel like in history we'll look back at this time, as we look back at the time when the Five Eyes community was established and 70 years ago with the US and Australian treaty. It really is revolutionary, and it will enable the deployment of technology for Australia and its allies to defend us for multi-domain challenges. So Northrop Grumman Australia, and I see industry colleagues here, whether we're primes or SMEs, really believe that industry is a key enabler to work with the US, the UK and the Australian government to reach the aims and objectives of the AUKUS agreement. And we stand ready to do so. And I'm delighted to be here today to hear our esteemed panel speak to the AUKUS agreement. I see the Honourable Ellen Lord is not yet joining us. I believe I'm to introduce the panel, which I will do. Debbie, do we... there we go. Very, very nice. Hello. Can you hear us? Yes, hello. Thank you. Welcome.
Absolutely. I can hear you loud and clear.
Wonderful. Well, it's my great pleasure to now introduce our panel, of course, starting with the Honourable John Howard, OMAC. Very short bios that really... that we'll just skim across, of course, this esteemed panel's experience. We know John Howard served as Australia's 25th Prime Minister between March 1996 and November 2007. He is our nation's second longest serving Prime Minister and was a Member of Parliament for 33 years. During his time as Prime Minister, he led a government with a wide reform agenda, restructuring industrial relations and leading economic reform. A staunch advocate of the ANZAC Treaty, and we know he was in Washington during the 9/11 attack and has seen firsthand how our countries work together when faced with difficulty. And so thank you for your service. The Honourable Ellen Lord, welcome. The Senate confirmed the Honourable Ellen Lord in August 2017 to serve as the Under-Secretary of Defence for Acquisition and Sustainment. She's responsible for all matters pertaining to acquisition, developmental testing, contract logistics, material readiness, and across a broad range of all of the acquisition and sustainment organisation and operations, including the Defence Industrial Base. Prior to this appointment, from 2012 to 2017, Ms Lord served as the President and CEO of Textron Systems Corporations, where she led a multi-billion-dollar industry, defence, security and aerospace. And she's spent more than 30 years in the defence industry. So thank you for your service. And also I send the regards of our Deputy Secretary of Capability and Acquisition and Sustainment, Tony Fraser, who really enjoys your partnership and sends his regards.
Thank you.
And then we have Cameron Stewart. He's the Associate Editor of The Australian. He was previously the paper's Washington correspondent covering North America from 2017 until 2021, and we really welcome your moderation today with your deep knowledge of the defence environment. So I am going to exit the stage, and I just invite our panellists here today to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, especially to Mr. Howard, to Ellen Lord.
Hello.
Very much looking forward to this this discussion on a huge topic. I note that it's an auspicious day to a degree because Carolyn Kennedy has been not approved as Australia's United States' ambassador to Canberra. So interesting timing to have a good chat about a hugely important topic. So what I want to do is keep it reasonably casual. Mr. Howard, I'll ask you a few questions. Ellen Lord, I'll ask you a few, and we'll bounce around. Feel free to interrupt each other if you want. We'll see how we go. So firstly, Mr. Howard, I wanted to ask you a big picture question. You know, we've spent the last few months gripped watching horrific events in Ukraine. What relevance do you think the war in Ukraine has for the Indo-Pacific and particularly for China's ambitions in the region?
Well, I can speculate like everybody else, and it can't be anything more than speculation. I think it might be giving Xi Jinping pause to think Taiwan might not be such an easy pushover, if that was his intention. I think the takeout everybody has from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is how remarkably strong has been the Ukrainian resistance. And perhaps not just the other side of the coin, but how inadequate has been the Russian military. I think this has revealed an extraordinary weakness in the Russian military. And I think it will do great damage to the perception around the world of Russia as a great military power. And I suppose when you examine the history of that country, which has had monumental losses in World War II, that perhaps it's never had a strong military. I mean, if the figures bandied around are to be believed, Russia's lost more people in Ukraine than it lost in Afghanistan in a few short months. I mean, it's a terrible indictment on their military. What impact, beyond what I said about Xi Jinping, I think it's made people wonder about energy. I think the impoverishment of Europe because of the denial of energy supplies from Russia is significant. I think it will cause a rethink of the energy policies of the former German administration. Maybe Angela Merkel's reputation will suffer as a consequence. The dependence of Germany on Russia for energy always seemed to me to be extraordinary. I think it might cause a lot of people to think that maybe some of the debate about the rush to renewables is ill-judged. At the present time, I think coal and other fossil fuels that country I'm very fond of has large reserves of will be even more valuable into the future. So there's some of my random, but like everybody else, I mean, I'm appalled at the loss of life, but it does remind us what sort of world we live in. Just imagine if everybody had had a mobile phone with a camera in it on the 4th of August 1914, and after the Battle of the Marne, I think that war may well have finished by Christmas, as so many people hoped and prayed on both sides it will, and we could have been spared that terrible slaughter.
Well, it's interesting, again to you, Mr. Howard. Since the AUKUS Pact was formed late last year, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had China sign a secretive security deal with the Solomon Islands in Australia's backyard. Do you think Australia's strategic outlook is changing for the worse, and how is AUKUS relevant to this?
Well, AUKUS is relevant because it brings us together with our two historic allies, and in the case of the United States, the still by far the superpower of the world. I think China is a different country under Xi Jinping than it was under Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin. My view is that the Australian government has not really contributed in a material way to the deterioration in relations. There's a strong continuity of policy from Australian governments, from the Whitlam government, the Fraser government, and my government and the Rudd government. I mean, you can criticise bits and pieces along the way, but China's important to Australia because it's a huge market, and we shouldn't gratuitously throw rocks at China, but equally we shouldn't give in to China, and I think the Morrison government has struck the right tone on that, and it seems, certainly in the context of this election campaign, it seems to have bipartisan support. But we have to worry about China's encroachment, but we also have to remember that there are a lot of antagonisms to China going back years from the region. I mean, Vietnam, the Vietnamese have had 900 years of poisonous relationship with the Chinese.
Well, in that respect, how do you think it's been received by the region, AUKUS?
I'm sorry?
How do you think AUKUS has been received
Look,
by the
I
region?
think, despite what some of them might say, I think AUKUS would be understood and privately applauded by some of them. I mean, I thought AUKUS was terrific. I don't mind saying it. I thought the original arrangement about submarines was puzzling. It puzzled me, but I didn't say so because I hear the view on those things that former Prime Ministers should, as far as possible, be a bit like Victorian era children, seen and not heard. And so, but I was delighted to see that, and because it's a natural fit. Now, obviously, we've got to work out what the interim arrangements are, and because these subs won't become available, but it will make inevitable the arrival of a nuclear power industry in Australia. I mean, it's not something that will be a feature of Australian politics in the next few months, but I don't think there's any doubt that we're going to have a nuclear power, and so we should. It makes sense. And I think the world is changing on that issue. I think public opinion is changing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Ellen Lord, thank you for being up so late. Do appreciate it.
Congratulations.
From your perspective over there, what's your view of how AUKUS was received both in the Capitol and at the Pentagon?
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you to the American Australian Association, as well as Northrop Grumman, to talk a little bit about AUKUS. I speak in my personal capacity. I just want to reinforce that as I left government last year. But one of the U.S.'s strengths is really that we have allies and friends, unlike our strategic competitors. So AUKUS coming out really is a logical extension of some of these relationships with UK and Australia, and an opportunity to really make it stronger. So I don't think it was surprising. However, the challenge, I think both in DOD as well as the White House, is how do you take policy and really translate that into implementation guidance? And the challenge here is really to use AUKUS to modernize what we have as exportability and releasability issues. In other words, we are not exporting our technology to our close allies in a way that is perhaps at the pace of all of these near-peer threats and technological innovation. So I think it's applauded, given that the Indo-Pacific region is so strategically important to us all. But now the challenge is, how do we move out crisply to really make AUKUS a framework to export, whether it be guided weapons or hypersonics or munitions or nuclear subs, so that Australia can really have its own indigenous capability, as well as perhaps serve as a second source for the US.
Okay, a follow-up question. There has been some scepticism in some quarters here that the United States, with so many levels of decision-making over there, might be somehow reluctant to ultimately share sensitive nuclear technology with Australia. What's your view on that?
I think we're working our way through it. There are many that are advocating that we need to get on with it. And as with any government process, you have people across the spectrum. However, I think going back to the Ukraine, for instance, we see where we have shortages of capabilities, and we also see where economic deterrence perhaps isn't working. And we go back to Ronald Reagan and peace through strength. I think we're rethinking what we need in terms of our friends and allies to have in terms of military capability. So I think Ukraine has really made the US in large part rethink what we need to do to share our technology, as well as speed up our own internal decision-making process.
Okay. Mr. Howard, obviously AUKUS is much broader than just nuclear-powered submarines, but you know, you've led this country for a long time. What do you feel the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines would mean for Australia's defence?
Oh, I think it'd be transformative. I think, given the geographical positioning of Australia and the importance of sea lanes, the distance to travel, it just means that we have to have an effective submarine fleet, and that means you've got to have nuclear submarines. And I just think it's so welcome.
Do you think it dovetails well with the strategic changes we're seeing in the region with the rise of China?
It does, but in a sense, it's an ageless asset once you have it, because it can demolish the distance. They can stay underwater for very inordinate lengths of time. It probably, I mean, I've never been a submariner. I must. You need a special kind of person to do that work, but I just think that it gives us a capability, and it also reinforces amongst the smaller countries in our region that we are a mature, serious player and participant. And the other thing to bear in mind is that we have a very close relationship with the United States, very close defence relationship, but we've got to carry our burdens as much as possible in our part of the world, and the more that we can have an independent or semi-independent defence capacity, the more effective our partnership with the United States really is. And one of the things that I found after the very successful Australian-led intervention in East Timor was that our allies, not just the Americans but others, saw Australia in an enhanced way as capable of leading, organising and leading an activity in our part of the world, and that adds value to the relationship.
Well, let me ask you here, with all these industry experts in the room, is the central plank of AUKUS, the acquisition or construction of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, actually possible for a country with no civil nuclear industry and no history of operating nuclear submarines?
Well, my understanding is that the advances in technology in this area make that far more feasible than people would have thought only a few years ago. Now, there'll be a lot of debate, and those who criticise it, both politically and perhaps out of self-interest in sections of the defence industry, might disagree with it. But I don't think you can gainsay the fact, though, that whether you can actually develop them without a full-scale nuclear industry, and there are suggestions that you can, but irrespective of that, we are marching towards a nuclear industry, and I don't think that's something that should be resisted. Now, a lot of people will disagree with me on that, but I think we are marching towards it, and I don't think it's going to be debated and resolved in the next couple of years, but I'd be surprised in 10 years' time if the debate weren't all over and we were a long way down the path towards it.
Ellen Lord, with your extensive experience in industry acquisition and everything else with your massive former job, let me ask you, what's your take on the feasibility of Australia acquiring or building nuclear-powered submarines, and in what time frame might this occur?
Well, the time frame is the key question, isn't it? I think it comes down to the resolve that we're going to move forward and setting up a cadence of communications and milestones to make this happen. So it comes down in large part to human capital as well. So what we're going to have to figure out is how the individuals get really educated in Australia, and that's going to take a lot of US participation. But I think this can be done in the next 8 to 10 years, but I think it takes resolve, and I think it takes planning, and I think it takes metrics and measurement, and I think senior leaders in government have to demand that, and I think industry will rally around that with the leadership of the US military to help them along.
And I'll follow up with, do you think it's feasible to build the submarines in Australia, or would it be more efficient and cheaper to build them in the US? That's my first question. The second half of it is, what should Australian defence industry be doing to prepare for this program?
Well, I think it's a crawl, walk, run. I think that initially you might want to start with a number of Australians in the US working alongside. And I think the notion of taking perhaps an older US submarine and bringing it to Australia with a skeleton crew of Americans to help begin to train might be the way to go about it. And then you start building up Indigenous capability for both the construction and the operation of it.
Okay. Mr. Howard, do you believe that the submarines should be built in Australia, and what priorities should guide that decision? Because you have an interesting thing.
Yeah, but I'm a pragmatist on these things. There's always pressure to build stuff in Australia, and if it makes economic and strategic and defence sense to do so, you do it. And you might even pay a premium, some premium in the process, but in the long run, you've got to have the hardware that you need both to defend and to project power. So I am a complete pragmatist. I mean, we've had endless arguments about, and we've made over the years some good decisions and some bad decisions, but I think governments have to be incredibly pragmatic, and we shouldn't turn ourselves inside out to sustain a capability in a part of the country when it's not really sustainable to do so.
So capability first is your
Absolutely. Well, defending the country.
If I may just interject.
Yes.
There is a challenge in the U.S. in terms of capacity and throughput in the shipyards. And right now, there's not a lot of margin on Columbia class, and Virginia's pretty busy as well. So when we're talking about can you build in Australia or not, I think you need to, because I'm not sure you're going to be able to do that in the U.S.
Well, that's all part of the capability argument.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to have the hardware to match the potential threat.
Well, that's right. I mean, would you see, Ellen Lord, that a possibility for, say, Australia to invest in a third shipyard for the Virginia class, for example? I mean, there's a lot of speculation about how you might be able to jump the queue somehow in the States, or is that just not possible, do you think?
Well, I think in large part, it comes down to the supply chain. So the shipyard is a part of it, but these supply chains go down 7, 8, 9 layers, and nuclear components have critical tolerances and other requirements that aren't analogous to other supply chain requirements. So I think that's where you need to start and build your way up.
Mr. Howard, are you, given these difficulties, everyone admits there are difficulties in getting this project actually going in some sort of timely fashion. Are you concerned that the long time frames, however, could result in a submarine capability gap in Australia?
Well, I think it should be a central objective of any government, whether it's the current one or any government that, perish the thought, of course, that might replace it. Absolutely, but to ensure there is no gap. I mean, there's always a danger if you don't take steps to fill the gap, and I would have thought that there's been a lot of analysis carried out ever since AUKUS was announced to work this out, and but we can't afford a gap. We just can't, and this is all a question of, you've just got to have a ruthlessly pragmatic defend Australia first sort of approach to these things. I mean, there's no other. I mean, it's not hard to sort of work out what the goal should be. It's hard getting there.
Exactly. Of course, and again, Mr. Howard, AUKUS is, of course, much more than just submarines. What do you see as the other benefits of the pact beyond submarines?
Well, I think it how shall I put it? In one grand stroke, it totally legitimises a close relationship between the three countries, and I think that's. I mean, they've had a close relationship. Goes without saying. There are no two countries in the world, along obviously with New Zealand, to which Australia is closer than to the United States and Great Britain. But the mindset of the defence establishments will be influenced very heavily by this decision. I think it may well have come as a surprise to sections of the Australian defence establishment, having been conditioned to, for a long time we went through this debate about would it be French, German or Japanese partnership, and we ended up, surprisingly in my view, with the French one, and now I think to the relief of the Australian community, we've ended up in a partnership with America and Britain, and that's a good thing. So I think the focus of defence planners will be on opportunities that I'm not aware of because I don't have enough detailed knowledge of it. But once a decision of this character is taken at the highest level of government by the three countries, it will bring forth a permanently changed mindset on defence equipment.
And Ellen Lord, following up there, what aspects of AUKUS do you see as most important beyond the submarines? And also, how do you think the defence industries in the three countries should best coordinate for the opportunities?
Well, I think the best way to coordinate for it is to use a lot of existing relationships and bilats and perhaps some of the hollow authorities we have, like the INTIB or the National Technology Innovation Base or Industrial Base. Really, Australia is part of that, along with the UK, and we haven't really leveraged it. So I think what we need to do to get going is have industry go to government and say what is holding up collaboration and getting going. So if you talk about what beyond nuclear subs, the guided weapons, particularly in Australia with GWIO and so forth, this is an opportunity to really get going on some guided weapons that have not been exported previously. So I think you have to pick specific proof points, if you will, specific systems that you work through and develop capability on, whether it be through the exportability or the releasability or just learning how to have the manufacturing lines built and how to actually operate them and then move forward. But I think it's also very helpful for hypersonics, where there already are some bilateral programs between Australia and the US, because it's a forcing function, again, to go and use some of the authorities and some of the capabilities. I think this really helps us in hypersonics, where we have a test and evaluation challenge with this type of technology. And the US really needs to use WUMA, for instance. But we also need to figure out how to develop very, very quickly and use digital engineering, use simulations and so forth. But again, munitions, there's a lot of opportunity there as well. But I think what we need to do is take this from a top down, saying AUKUS clearly gives us these authorities. Let's flesh out some of the details under the INTIB construct, and let's use the 2+2 and the ADAC and some of these other forums to really push forward. But industry needs to pick a few test cases, if you will, and work them through in terms of their specifics, versus, in my opinion, sitting around and talking about generalities, because we never get anywhere when we do that. So I think we have to take high priority systems and really begin to push them through.
Okay, let's just touch briefly on the politics of AUKUS. I wanted to ask you both, starting with you, Alan Lord. All three governments are on the same page with AUKUS now, but if we're looking at a 20-year time frame, perhaps for the first submarine, for example, in that time we will see perhaps 5 presidential elections, 7 Australian elections, and 4 British elections. Do you think AUKUS can endure, and if so, why?
I think it can endure because we have a common threat. And I think the threat is growing, and our overmatch capability is not growing as allies, and we need to change that. So I think a common threat helps bring us all together. In the US, the different administrations are very significant, but so is Congress. So anything you get done in DC, you need both the executive and the legislative branches. So I think we need to remember that and work both sides. But again, I think the Ukraine situation has been a wake-up call for everyone, and we should, keep that front and center and use it as an example.
Mr. Howard, what about your thoughts on the endurability of AUKUS over 20 years and many administrations?
Well, I think there's very strong apparent bipartisan support for it in Australia at present, and I don't say this in a partisan way, but it's a reality because of past history. But absent a revision of the Labor Party's attitude, and remember that in the two, how shall I phrase it, controversial military operations by the United States in the last 70 or 80 years, strongly supported by Australia, namely Vietnam and Iraq, the Labor Party opposed both of them. Now, they would argue they had reason to do so, and I don't want to in any way politically litigate that. But I'm just saying that so everybody's aware that there's a range of views. But I think it will endure, because one of the things that has always reassured me about the American-Australian relationship is that between the two countries it crossed the party divide. We had a broadly centre-right Menzies government supporting, first of all, the broadly centre-left Kennedy-Johnson administrations in Vietnam, and so there was never any doubt that of the support coming from Australia on that score. So I'm pretty confident, but it's a long time frame as to what might happen in domestic British politics. I don't think the significance of the relationship between America and Britain will diminish. I get the impression that the current British government rather enjoys the freedom of action post-Brexit has given it. It's able to actually do things in advance of getting the consent of 26 other governments. And they've done it well. Now, I understand that the current British government, Prime Minister, has some domestic political challenges, which I follow with great interest, but I think it will stick, I really do, because it's a relationship sanctioned by history and a relationship that is a natural fit in so many ways of three countries that have so much in common, although our political systems, as we're being reminded at the present time in the United States, the certain domestic issues involving the Supreme Court are very different.
Certainly in Australia, I think it's fair to say that AUKUS has been
Very
well received at a bipartisan level as well. An exception to that, of course, is your predecessor, Paul Keating, who said that it was a misguided attempt to find our security from Asia rather than in Asia. What do you say to that?
Well, you quoted him, I didn't, but I don't agree with him, and I don't, as you might expect, I have never taken the view that we should look at Asia in terms of whether we see our security in Asia or separate from Asia. I think you must always see your security in terms of your alignments and friendships, first of all with countries that have a common set of values, have great military capacity, and also share your part of the world. That means we have a close alliance with the United States, and we also build on the relationships we have with our Asian neighbours. And I think one of the really good developments under this current government in this context has been the development of the Quad, which was disavowed some years ago, but has come back stronger than ever, and I think it's a wonderful relationship. You've got the largest democracy numerically in the world. You've got in Japan, a country that was the iron lung of the Australian export industry for so many years until we found China wanted even more. And of course, we're there with the United States. So I think it stands to reason that it's in the long-term interest of this country to have those sorts of arrangements. And I think the reason the Australian public like AUKUS so much is not just sentimentality or nostalgia being in unison with our old alliances, but because it just makes common sense.
Does it send a message? And if so, who to?
Well, it sends a message, obviously, to China. Of course it does. But because China is the country in the region which is jabbing its finger at people. Now, that might change, and if it does change, then partly that will be due to a realistic assessment, but it may not change. And I think people like the idea of having a good relationship with China, but on terms that are respectful to our traditions and our values. And I think that is the position we are at now. But we must be careful, as I said at the beginning of my remarks. We don't gratuitously throw rocks at China. Okay, China's not like us, but gee, there's 1.4 million Australians of Chinese heritage. Chinese is the most widely spoken foreign language in Australia, and it's a terrific export destination. And I was in South Australia yesterday, and the South Australia is known for many wonderful things, and one of them is the wine industry. And of course, some of the decisions taken by the Chinese have affected the wine industry, not too much, but certainly to some degree. So we've got to be very balanced in our attitude to China. I'm not in favour of bragging about how tough we are, but I am in favour of being tough.
Okay. Ellen Lord,
So, Cameron,
yes, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there's an important point to AUKUS relative to the US and Australia that we haven't touched on. And that's the fact that the US really needs a lot of Australia's capability, whether it be rare earth minerals or whether it be pre-positioning stocks from a logistical point of view. So it really is a two-way street. And I think that perhaps AUKUS is providing a framework to follow up on a number of disparate items that haven't been linked together, showing the intertwining of our national security and our economic security here. And I think the US and Australia can help one another there.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And Ellen Lord, now that the dust has settled on the initial AUKUS announcement, what's your impression of the efforts being made in Washington to make it work? I know there's quite a big AUKUS office that's been set up. What's your impression of what's happening over there?
I don't think we've heard generally quite as much about AUKUS in the industry side and throughout all of government. So I believe there's a bit of impatience to get going. And I think for AUKUS to endure, we do have to demonstrate planning and execution. Now, obviously, there's a lot of studying and these decisions have to be data driven. But I think in general, the industry as well as government would like to hear more about it. And I'm always a fan of, build the model and test the model and change things, but let's get going.
Do you anticipate that's going to change, that we are going to have a bit more of an understanding, a few more announcements, a few more pronouncements from the American side, because there really hasn't been very much on either side of the Pacific so far?
No, it's been heads down, and I anticipate in the next 3 months or so, different groups are going to begin to report out on a way forward.
Right, okay. Look, as a journalist, it's always fun to ask a question that someone won't answer. So, Ellen Lord, I have to ask you first, should Australia choose an American or a British submarine?
Oh, please. May the best submarine win.
Was worthwhile. Mr. Howard, would you venture a guess?
Whichever one best suits Australia's needs.
And
I'm not technically informed to express a view. I've heard arguments on both sides, and I won't get into that. But whatever is best for Australia, not what is best for America or best for Britain, whatever is best for Australia.
And there's a few.
You need to understand as well that the US works pretty carefully with the UK on nuclear systems. There are guidelines and so forth.
Yeah,
but
I'm aware of that, the coziness of that relationship, yes.
Mr. Howard, I have to ask you, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Don't worry, there's not a political question, you can relax.
No, of course not.
But at a time of great strategic uncertainty for Australia, for the US as well, for the world in fact, do you think national security is a factor that perhaps many Australians are considering more than they would in this election compared to many previous elections?
I don't think more than some previous elections. I mean, national security was a huge issue in the 2001 election because it was in the wake of 9/11, and of course in the 1960s, national security dominated the political debate. So I don't think in that sense it's rare, but I think it's probably on a par with how national security ranked in the past couple of elections. I think probably though the huge focus on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, plus the Chinese excursion into the Solomon Islands, I think both of those things have lifted the salience of national security as issues. Now, what impact that has, I think it might invite the question is which side of politics has got credentials on those issues, but that's bringing politics into what is a passionately bipartisan discussion.
Exactly. Ellen Lord, can I ask you, why do you think this is the right time for a pact such as AUKUS? I mean, why didn't we have a pact like this perhaps in previous years, and why do you think this is the right time for it?
I think it's the right time because we are in this near peer competition that we really haven't seen in the past. So again, I think world events are a bit of a forcing function. I also think technology is moving forward at such a pace compared to the past that it takes a large group to really harness what's there and get the reps and sets, if you will, in terms of testing and demonstrating. So I think if there are more resources to do that that are like-minded, it is helpful. And I think that's where, you know, the UK, Australia, and the US can work together, building on past work together, but really focusing on a common goal here.
And can I ask you just a follow-up? There's a lot of, obviously, Australia watches very carefully what the administrations do in relation to China, given AUKUS, given Australia's strategic circumstance. For the benefit of people here in the room, do you see much difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration's approach to China?
Yes, I think that there is a bit of analysis and studying still going on. So I don't think it's clear exactly what we're going to see from the Biden administration.
Okay. And Mr. Howard, Britain, of course, Britain gets mentioned the least often in the AUKUS Pact for no particular reason. What about Britain? Why do you think it wants a greater involvement in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, partly because of Brexit, but Britain historically has an enormous connection with this part of the world. And the lingua franca of the region is English, and there are enormous associations. And I think, particularly under the present Prime Minister, who, because of his own past experience and his natural instincts, has quite an affection for Australia. I mean, he did teach here at one stage, and he developed a very close association with the Westfield Corporation when it was building that giant shopping mall in London and teaching the British the joys of shopping in malls and not just the high street. So there are a lot of reasons, historical and otherwise, but I think consistent with the notion, whether it's wildly optimistic or not, only time will tell, of a global Britain, I think there. And Britain has always, I think, seen the association with the United States, which over the years has been called the special relationship, as more important than strategically her association with Europe. I think it was one of the things that lay behind the simmering resentment of being part of the EU that finally burst forth and wisely, in my view, resulted in the vote in favour of Brexit.
Look, it's been a fascinating discussion. I wanted to finish off by asking both of you just a very simple question. What, with AUKUS has been, obviously, it's a massive project, a massive concept. There's been a lot of talk about it. We're now going to have to put actual actions behind the rhetoric. Can I ask you first, Alan Lord, what do you think needs to be done now to get the wheels moving?
I think there needs to be a cadence of communications that's very regular, predictable, and it takes all three parties echoing and amplifying the same statements. I think that lack of regular cadence of communications is not healthy for an initiative.
Okay, and Mr. Howard?
I think resolve as soon as possible the issue of the gap.
Okay.
I mean, if it looks as though that is not being filled, the enthusiasm and support we now have will drain away.
Right, so that should be addressed as soon as possible.
Yes, it should be addressed as soon as feasible. It really must be.
Okay, well, hopefully if we're here in a few years' time, things will have happened. But we'll have to wait and see. Look, we're very privileged to have two wonderful minds here to share their thoughts on this incredibly important topic. So thank you both very, very much for your time, and Ellen for staying up so late.
Thank you. Bye now.
I have to say, it is a joy to be back in Australia finally again after 2.5 years hiatus. I landed this morning, and it's as beautiful and lovely here as I remember it, and the hospitality is always overwhelming. So I want to say thank you for welcoming all of us Americans back in the same spirit of AUKUS. I have to say first, let me just express the delight of having just spent a lovely meal meeting with and chatting with former Prime Minister. That's, of course, a treat for someone like me. Never grew up, thought I would do such a thing. But to get the insight of his experience on how the geopolitical world swirls around and arrives at decisions like AUKUS is particularly gratifying, and I really appreciate that, as do many here, I'm sure. And also to Secretary Lord, I don't know if she's still on, but I spent many an hour in her office when she was secretary talking about subjects like this and how to unlock the path to partnership and export of U.S. technology and partnership with Australians and British companies so that we could share technology. I will tell you that will be the Achilles heel. That is the soft underbelly of AUKUS. The system does not support what we all aspire to do. And one of the jobs that I try to undertake in Washington is to try to break that system and rebuild it in a way that is conducive to the better good and the full aspiration that AUKUS represents. AUKUS came to life, I think you asked the question, Cameron, actually, why now? AUKUS is real. First of all, I think the foundations of AUKUS have been around for 100 years, and the mateship, the partnership, the trust that's been built between our nations through fighting together and working together, and that has always been there, and I think that is why it will be enduring. But the framework called AUKUS today, I think came to light and it became manifest because of the threat. I spent a lot of time actually in Washington in classified briefings on the threat, and I wish I could tell you some of it, but it would scare you to death. The rate at which the threat is advancing far outpaces the rate at which the AUKUS countries are able to meet it. We still do have an advantage in many areas, but in some we don't. And if we don't join forces and accelerate the rate at which we collaborate, we will lose the advantage. And I think that 20 years is too long. We don't have 20 years. So we have to figure out solutions much more quickly than that and cause the establishment to change in a way that allows us to bring the very best ideas together, Australian, US, and British, in a way that manifests a new capability, whether it's undersea or in outer space, for all of us to share so that we can at least keep pace, if not outpace, the threat. And I wish that it was more publicly acknowledged just how significant the rate of capability that is aligned against our better wishes is advancing. Because of that, we must acknowledge at least that in order to try to keep pace, if not actually advance in front of this threat, we've got to have the best talent. And if we don't fund the best talent, we will lose this battle. And so it's with great pleasure that I announced today that we're going to add another $120,000 through the American Australian Association to fund 3 scholarships for PhD students to share their energy in their educational process to focus on technologies that matter to AUKUS. And so Northrop Grumman and AAA will put that money to work, and 3 of your very best scientists will go to the United States and get PhDs on this money, and we'll continue to do this as long as the threat is advancing. And so I want to say thanks to Debbie and to Melissa for that. Really appreciate it. And then finally, I guess it's just worth saying, whenever I come here, and I used to come here probably half a dozen times a year. It's been a little bit of a hiatus, but I never feel out of place or unwelcome. And I think that is what causes us to bind together, because we all believe in the same values. We all want the same things for our kids, and we all choose to a path in life to join together in a way that manifests a greater good. And I think AUKUS, as many challenges as it might encounter, will find a way to overcome each one of them and coming from a family of submariners, I'm very intimately familiar with just about everything that has to do with nuclear submarines. In fact, I used to drive them around for a long time, and when I got out of the Navy, I ended up, my first big job in Northrop was running the company that builds the nuclear propulsion systems for our aircraft carriers and our submarines. So I know them pretty well, and I would say you don't want to try to do that alone. That's a very tough drill. It'd probably take you 50 years just to figure out how to build the first one, and it probably would be noisy and not very useful. So I would suggest we partner and find a way to do it together. Here's the thought, and this is, I'll close with this. Why would the United States or Britain covet a partnership with Australia when they already have nuclear submarines? It's a hell of a long way across the Pacific Ocean in a submarine that's trying to be quiet. It'd be far better to operate from a place like Australia with friends, where rather than going all the way back to the West Coast or the East Coast. This has strategic advantage like no other place on Earth. And if we can find ways to effectively field a fleet of nuclear submarines that can hold the adversary at bay and deter them from acting rather than having to fight them, we will win. If we had the advantage of physical location here, where all our submarines could jointly be sustained here, resupplied here, and crewed from here, I don't think anyone would ever try to confront such a threat to them. And remember, when Australia has a nuclear submarine, whether that submarine is here in Homeport or off the coast of China, they have to think that it's there. So the deterrent effect of having nuclear submarines is present to our adversaries 24/7, 365 days a year, whether or not the submarine is actually there or not, because they can't find it. And they have to believe that within seconds, we could strike back. And that will change their attitude and their willingness to engage in any kind of fight with Australia or the UK or the United States. So I say, cheers to AUKUS. Let's go get it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody.